The soft hum of engines filled the bridge of the Stellar Confederation vessel, Starlight. Commander Lyra stood at her post, her iridescent scales reflecting the glow of multiple screens. Her long neck curved gracefully as she studied the ancient records displayed before her. The ship's computer had been translating texts from a recently discovered archive, and what Lyra read made her blink her large eyes in disbelief. The record spoke of a species called humans, creatures that seemed more like monsters from children's stories than real beings. "Impossible," she muttered, her tail swishing back and forth. The texts described beings that could run for hours without rest, fight through incredible injuries, and survive in conditions that would kill most species. Even more unbelievable were the accounts of their warfare. Stories of humans fighting hand-to-hand against creatures twice their size and winning. "Commander," her science officer called out, "we've finished analyzing the battle footage from the archives." Lyra moved to the main viewing screen, where grainy images showed bipedal creatures moving with frightening speed and precision. Her species, the Ariel, had evolved from peaceful plant eaters who solved conflicts through discussion and compromise. The very concept of physical combat was foreign to them. These records must be propaganda, she decided, switching off the display. No species could be so aggressive and still build a civilization. The quiet of the bridge was suddenly broken by an emergency signal. Red lights flashed across the ceiling as a distress call echoed through the speakers. "Help! This is Mining Colony 7. We're under attack. Pirates have breached our outer defenses." The voice was filled with panic. Lyra straightened her uniform. "Set course for Mining Colony 7. Maximum speed." The Starlight jumped into faster-than-light travel, its engines pushing to their limits. During the journey, Lyra reviewed the colony's details. It was a small operation, mining rare minerals from an asteroid belt. The population was mixed, various species working together, including some humans. When they arrived, the scene before them was chaos. Small ships darted around the colony's main structure, firing weapons. The colony's shields were failing, and several sections showed damage. "Scan for life signs," Lyra ordered. "Multiple signatures detected, Commander. Most colonists have retreated to the central hub. But there's something strange. One life sign is moving through the outer sections. It's human." Lyra remembered the ancient records. Could they be true? Was one human actually fighting back against the raiders? "Prepare landing pods," she commanded. "We're going down there." As their pods approached the colony, Lyra saw the destruction up close. Blast marks scared the walls, and debris floated in the low gravity. Her security team, armed with standard stun weapons, looked nervous. They had never faced real combat. The pods docked at an emergency airlock. As they stepped into the colony's corridors, they heard distant weapons fire and shouting. "Life support is stable," her officer reported, "but internal security systems are down." They moved carefully through the hallways, following the sounds of conflict. Suddenly, a group of raiders ran past an intersection ahead of them, looking terrified. They didn't even notice Lyra's team. Then she saw him. At the end of the corridor stood a human male. He wore simple protective gear and held what appeared to be a primitive projectile weapon. His stance was perfectly balanced, ready to move in any direction. But it was his eyes that caught Lyra's attention. They burned with an intensity she had never seen before, scanning everything, missing nothing. Those eyes locked onto her, and for the first time in her life, Lyra understood what true fear felt like. This wasn't just another spacefaring species. This was something else, a warrior, a hunter, a protector. The ancient records flashed through her mind. They weren't exaggerations or myths. They were warnings. Humanity wasn't just another member of the galactic community. They were the descendants of apex predators, and they had brought their hunting instincts to the stars. The human's expression remained neutral as he assessed her team. Finally, he spoke in a calm, controlled voice that somehow made him even more intimidating. "You might want to duck." "Duck." The human's voice rang out again, and Lyra's body responded before her mind could process the command. A blast of energy passed over her head, striking a raider who had been trying to sneak up behind her team. The human moved with shocking speed, crossing the distance between them in seconds. Up close, Lyra could see the details she'd missed earlier: scars on his arms, worn equipment that showed signs of frequent use, and eyes that never stopped moving. "Name's Dan," he said, checking his weapon with practiced ease. "I'm Colony Security. Your Confederation." Lyra straightened herself, trying to maintain her commanding presence despite her racing heart. "Commander Lyra of the Starlight, we received your distress signal." A distant explosion shook the corridor. Dan's head snapped toward the sound, his body tensing like a coiled spring. "We've got about 30 colonists in the safe room. Raiders cut off our main escape route." Lyra watched as he pulled up a holographic map from his wrist device. His movements were efficient, no energy wasted. She had never seen anything like it. Her own people took pride in their peaceful nature, their ability to think and negotiate. But this human, he seemed built for conflict. "Tell me about the raiders," she said, pushing aside her instinctive unease. 2 ships, maybe 20 fighters. They're after our mineral storage." Dan paused, listening to something through his earpiece. "They're not professionals. Got sloppy when they met resistance." Another explosion rocked the station. This time, warning lights began flashing. "They've breached the lower levels," one of Lyra's officers reported, voice shaking. Dan checked his ammunition. "Your people ever been in a real fight, Commander?" Lyra's scales shifted color slightly, a sign of embarrassment in her species. "We're trained in defensive procedures." A slight smile crossed Dan's face, but his eyes remained serious. "Stay behind me. Shot to stun, aim for center mass. They're wearing cheap armor. It'll light up like a Christmas tree with enough stun rounds." Before Lyra could ask what a Christmas tree was, Dan was moving. His movements reminded her of the predator species she'd studied. Efficient, purposeful, deadly. Her team followed, trying to match his quiet steps. They encountered the first group of raiders at a junction. Dan moved before the raiders even knew they were there. 3 stun shots, 3 bodies hitting the floor. No wasted motion, no hesitation. "How?" one of Lyra's officers started to ask. "Practice," Dan replied, already moving forward. "Lots of practice." They made their way through the station's corridors, securing each section. Lyra found herself studying the human's tactics. He never took unnecessary risks, always checked corners, kept track of ammunition. This wasn't blind aggression. It was calculated, controlled violence. Near the mineral storage, they faced the largest group of raiders. In the tight corridor, Lyra expected them to be at a disadvantage. But Dan seemed to come alive in the chaos. He used the corridor's layout like a weapon, forcing the raiders to bunch up. His accuracy was incredible. Each shot found its target despite the poor lighting and moving targets. When his weapon needed reloading, he switched to hand-to-hand combat with a smoothness that left Lyra stunned. "Commander," Dan's voice snapped her back to reality. "The control panel. Override the gravity in Section 4. Lyra rushed to the panel, understanding his plan. With the gravity disabled, the raiders lost their footing, becoming easy targets for stun rounds. In minutes, it was over. The raiders lay unconscious, their weapons scattered around them. Dan was checking each one, securing their hands with restraints. "I've never..." Lyra started, then stopped, unsure how to continue. Dan looked up at her, and for a moment, she saw something soften in those warriors' eyes. "It's not about wanting to fight, Commander. It's about being ready to protect what matters." For the first time, Lyra began to understand. These humans weren't just warriors. They were guardians. Their capacity for violence existed alongside a deep drive to protect. It was a contradiction that both terrified and fascinated her. The station's alarms finally fell silent, But Lyra knew this was just the beginning of a much longer story. The command center of Mining Colony 7 hummed with activity as Lyra and Dan reviewed security footage. The raiders' ships still lurked at the edge of the system, just outside weapons range. Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. "They'll be back," Dan said, echoing her thoughts. He stood beside her, cleaning his weapon with practiced movements. These weren't just random pirates. Their attack pattern was too organized. Lyra watched his hands work, noting how even this simple maintenance task showed years of experience. "How did you learn all this?" she asked, curiosity overcoming her natural caution. Dan paused, considering his words. "On Earth, we have a long history of warfare, but it's more than that." He set his weapon down. "Humans evolved as persistence hunters. We'd chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion." The concept made Lyra's scales ripple with discomfort. Chase. For how long? Hours, sometimes days. Dan pulled up a holographic display of Earth. "Our bodies evolved to run long distances, to track, to think while moving. We're built to keep going when other species would stop." Lyra remembered how smoothly he had moved during the fight, how he never seemed to tire. "And this hunting, it shaped your combat abilities. It shaped everything about us." Dan zoomed in on different Earth terrains. "We learned to adapt to any environment, to use tools, to work in teams. When we faced predators stronger than us, we learned strategy. When we needed to protect our families, we learned warfare." A warning beep from the colony sensors interrupted them. More ships were appearing at the system's edge. "They're gathering reinforcements," Lyra observed, counting the new signatures. Dan nodded, already moving to the weapons locker. "The colony's defenses won't hold against a coordinated attack. We need a plan." Lyra watched as he began distributing weapons to qualified colonists. Each person received brief but thorough instructions, regardless of their species. She noticed how he adapted his teaching style for each individual, showing unexpected patience. "Why do you protect these people?" she asked. "They're not your species." Dan looked up from adjusting a colonist's grip on a stun rifle. "Does that matter?" "They needed help. Where I come from, that's enough." The simplicity of his answer surprised her. Her people would have formed committees, discussed implications, weighed options. But this human simply saw a need and acted. "Commander," one of her officers called out, "long-range scans show at least 3 heavy cruisers among the raider fleet." Dan's expression turned grim. "They're not here just for minerals anymore. This is about revenge." "The Confederation fleet is too far to help," Lyra said, running calculations in her head. "We have my ship, the colony's defenses, and whatever weapons we can cobble together. Then we work with what we have." Dan started drawing up defensive positions on the colony map. "Your people are peaceful, but you're also smart. We need both right now." For the next few hours, they worked together. Dan taught basic combat techniques while Lyra's crew modified the colony systems. She found herself admiring how he broke down complex combat concepts into simple instructions that even her peace-loving officers could understand. "Remember," he told the gathered defenders, "we're not fighting because we love violence. We're fighting because sometimes you have to stand up to those who would harm others." Lyra watched the colonists absorb his words. She saw fear in their eyes, but also determination. This human had somehow inspired them to find strength they didn't know they had. As they finished their preparations, Dan turned to her. "Your people might not be warriors by nature, Commander, but sometimes the strongest warriors are those who fight only when they must." Looking at the determined faces around her, Lyra began to understand something about humans. They weren't just beings of violence. They were protectors who had learned to fight, because the galaxy wasn't always kind. Their strength came not from loving war, but from being willing to face it when necessary. The raiders would be arriving soon, and for the first time in her life, Lyra was glad to have a warrior at her side. The first attack came exactly as Dan predicted. 3 raider ships targeted the colony's main power generators, while their heavy cruisers hung back, waiting to strike. Classic divide and conquer, Dan muttered, watching the tactical display. They think we'll split our forces to protect the generators. Lyra stood beside him in the reinforced command center, her scales shifting colors with tension. Won't we? No. Dan's voice was calm, but his eyes never left the screen. We're going to let them think they've won the first round. The raiders' shots hit their targets, and several generators went dark. Emergency lights flashed throughout the colony as systems switched to backup power. Dan remained still, watching. Now, he said softly, watch what they do next. Sure enough, the raiders sent boarding parties toward the seemingly weakened sections. They never noticed the modified sensor buoys Dan had helped place, disguised as debris from their first attack. Your people may not like fighting, Dan said to Lyra, but you understand technology better than most species I've met. Those sensor modifications are brilliant. Before Lyra could respond, the first boarding party breached the outer hull. The raiders charged in, expecting to find panicked colonists. Instead, they met carefully planned crossfire from multiple positions. Dan's voice came through clear on all channels. Remember your training. Stick to the high ground. Make every shot count. Lyra watched in amazement as the defensive plan unfolded. The colonists, despite their lack of combat experience, held their positions. They used the station's architecture just as Dan had taught them, turning corridors into killing zones for their stun weapons. Through the security feeds, she saw different species working together in ways she'd never imagined. A group of her own people, typically peaceful Ariels, used their natural ability to change color to blend with the walls, becoming perfect spotters for the defense teams. They're pulling back, one of her officers reported. First wave retreating. Dan nodded, but his expression remained serious. They'll try something bigger next. Those heavy cruisers haven't moved yet. As if on cue, the radar lit up with new signatures. The raiders' main force was moving in, led by their largest ship. They're targeting the main hub, Lyra said, analyzing the approach vectors. If they breach that section, they won't. Dan's voice carried absolute certainty. He pressed a button on his comm unit. All teams, Phase 2. Remember, just like we practiced. The raider ships moved closer, their weapons charging. But just as they came into range, something unexpected happened. The debris field around the colony came to life. The mineral containers. Lyra gasped, suddenly understanding. You modified them into mines. The raiders' formation broke as explosions bloomed around them. The carefully positioned mineral containers, filled with volatile compounds from the mine, created a chain reaction that scattered their attack force. Inside the station, the defenders held their positions. Every time the raiders tried to establish a foothold, they found their routes blocked or their forces divided. Dan moved between defensive positions, offering quiet encouragement or quick tactical adjustments. Lyra followed him, observing how he seemed to sense trouble before it happened. At one point, he pulled a young colonist back just seconds before a raider's shot hit where they'd been standing. How did you know? She asked him during a brief lull. Dan checked his weapon while answering. Experience, pattern recognition, but mostly. He paused, looking at the scared but determined faces around them. Mostly it's about remembering what you're fighting for. The raiders' attacks continued, but each one seemed less coordinated than the last. The colonial defenders, growing more confident with each successful defense, worked together with increasing efficiency. Lyra realized she was witnessing something remarkable. These beings, many of whom had never fought before today, were discovering their own kind of strength. Not the aggressive power of natural warriors, but the determined resistance of those protecting their home. And at the center of it all was the human, teaching them not just how to fight, but why some fights were worth facing. The siege was far from over, but something had changed in the colony's defenders. They were no longer just survivors waiting for rescue. They had become a force to be reckoned with. The mining colony's makeshift medical bay buzzed with quiet activity as Lyra helped tend to the wounded. Despite their successful defense, some defenders had suffered injuries. Dan moved among them, checking on each person, learning their names, offering words of encouragement. "I don't understand," Lyra said as Dan finished changing a bandage for an injured colonist. "In battle, you're like a force of nature. But here..." Dan sat down beside her, his shoulders showing the first signs of fatigue she'd seen. Being a warrior isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing why you fight. A young Errol approached them, her scales shifting nervously. She had fought well during the last attack, surprising everyone including herself. The raiders, they're regrouping again. But this time, it's different. Dan stood, his weariness vanishing instantly. At the tactical display, they watched as the enemy ships formed a new pattern. "They're learning," Dan observed, his eyes narrowing. "See how they're positioning their ships. They're adapting to our defenses." Lyra studied the formation. "That's a suicide run pattern. They mean to breach the hull, no matter the cost." Desperate people make dangerous enemies. Dan turned to address the gathered defenders. "They think we're tired. They think we'll break. But they don't understand what makes a true warrior." He pulled up a schematic of the colony. A warrior isn't someone who loves violence. A warrior is someone who stands between danger and those who can't protect themselves. As he spoke, Lyra watched the others. She saw how they straightened, how their fear turned to determination. This human had a gift for reaching into others and finding strength they didn't know they possessed. "We've got multiple hull breaches." An alarm blared through the colony. "They're coming in through maintenance shafts." Dan's response was immediate. "Fall back to secondary positions. Remember your training. Fight smart, not hard." As they moved to their defensive positions, Lyra finally understood what she was seeing. The human wasn't just fighting. He was protecting, teaching, leading. Every action had purpose beyond simple violence. "They call humans apex predators," Dan said as they took position behind a reinforced barrier. "But that's not quite right. We're protectors who learned to fight because we had to." The first wave of raiders burst through a nearby airlock. Instead of charging in, the defenders held their ground, using coordinated fire just as they'd practiced. Dan's tactics weren't about overwhelming force. They were about smart defense, about protecting each other. "Watch each other's backs," Dan called out. "Move in pairs. Remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves." A raider's shot grazed Lyra's arm. Before she could react, Dan was there, pulling her to safety while returning fire. His movements were precise, efficient, but his priority was clearly protection, not aggression. "Are you all right?" he asked, checking her injury. "Yes, but why did you risk yourself?" Dan smiled slightly while reloading his weapon. "Because that's what warriors do. We protect. Everything else, the fighting, the tactics, the weapons, those are just tools. The core of being a warrior is standing up for others." Through the next hours, Lyra watched Dan demonstrate this philosophy again and again. He never asked anyone to take risks he wouldn't take himself. When a defender fell, he was first to provide cover fire for their rescue. When someone's position was compromised, he made sure they had a safe route to fall back. The raiders pressed their attack, but they faced something they hadn't expected. Not just resistance, but a unified defense born of Dan's teachings. The colonists weren't fighting like warriors. They were fighting like protectors. As another wave of raiders fell back, Lyra realized that her people had been wrong about humans. They weren't just violent creatures who loved combat. They were beings who had mastered the art of protection, who had learned to fight because sometimes the universe required it. And in learning this truth, she found herself becoming something new as well. Not just a commander, but a protector in her own right. The final assault began with a deafening explosion that shook the entire colony. The raiders had deployed their heaviest weapons, determined to end this fight once and for all. Multiple breaches. The warning echoed through every corridor. They're coming through all sectors. Dan stood in the command center, his expression intense but focused. This is it. They're committing everything they have. He turned to Lyra, ready for the last stand. Through the security feeds, they watched as raiders poured into the colony. But this time was different. The raiders moved with desperate fury, no longer caring about losses or tactical advantage. They're not trying to steal anymore, Lyra realized. They want to destroy the colony completely. Dan checked his weapon one final time. Time to show them why that's a mistake. All units, execute Protocol Omega. The battle that followed would be talked about in spaceports across the galaxy for years to come. The defenders, trained by Dan over the past days, moved like they'd been fighting together for years. Lyra watched in amazement as Dan's true capabilities emerged. He moved through the colony like a force of nature, appearing wherever the fighting was thickest. Raiders who encountered him found themselves facing something from their worst nightmares, a human fighting at full capacity. How is he still going? One of Lyra's officers asked in awe. They watched as Dan took on 3 raiders at once in close combat, his movements a blur of controlled violence. Endurance hunting. Lyra remembered their earlier conversation. They evolved to never stop. The raiders had numbers and firepower, but they didn't have what the defenders had built under Dan's leadership, unity and purpose. Every colonist fought not just for themselves, but for each other. In one section, a group of Aerials used their color-changing abilities to ambush raiders, their coordinated attacks forcing the enemy into prepared kill zones. In another, the colony's engineers turned maintenance systems into weapons, filling corridors with disabling gas. Dan's voice remained steady on the comm, directing the defense with uncanny precision. Section 4. Fall back to Point Charlie. Section 6. Flank and suppress. A massive explosion rocked the colony's main hub. Through the smoke, the raiders' leader emerged, towering and heavily armed. This ends now, the raider chief growled, targeting systems locking onto Dan. What happened next would become legend. Dan moved with impossible speed, closing the distance before the raider could fire. The fight that followed was like nothing Lyra had ever seen. Pure human combat abilities unleashed. The raider chief was stronger, but Dan was faster, smarter, and fought with a skill born from humanity's long history of warfare. He turned the raider's strength against him, used the environment as a weapon, and never stopped moving. Impossible, the raider gasped as Dan locked him in a submission hold. What are you? I'm human, Dan replied simply, before rendering the raider unconscious. The fall of their leader broke something in the remaining raiders. Their attacks became disorganized, desperate. The defenders pressed their advantage, working together to secure section after section. Hours later, it was over. The raiders were captured, or had retreated, their ships fleeing the system. The colony had held. In the aftermath, Lyra found Dan tending to wounded defenders, still moving despite hours of continuous combat. I've never seen anything like that, she said quietly. Dan looked up, his eyes tired but alert. Humans aren't special because we're strong or fast. We're special because we never give up, especially when protecting others. Around them, colonists of various species helped each other with repairs and medical care. The battle had changed them all. They had faced their fears and found strength they never knew they had. The legend of the human warrior would spread, but not just for his fighting prowess. It would spread because he had shown them all what it truly meant to be strong, not just in combat, but in spirit, in determination, and in the will to protect others. Looking at the tired but proud faces around her, Lyra knew she would never again doubt the stories about human warriors. She had seen one in action, and more importantly, she had learned why they fought. 1 week after the battle, Mining Colony 7 hummed with the sounds of reconstruction. The scars of combat still marked its walls, but they now stood as reminders of what its people had accomplished together. Lyra stood in her ship's airlock, preparing to depart. Her report to the Stellar Confederation lay complete in her datapad, though she knew many would find it hard to believe. "You're really going to tell them everything?" Dan asked, standing nearby to see her off. "Every detail," she confirmed, "though I doubt the Council will fully understand until they see it for themselves." Around them, the colony bustled with activity. Species that had once barely interacted now worked side by side, strengthened by their shared experience. The battle had changed more than just the colony's defenses. It had transformed its people. "The Raiders' ships have been tracked to the Outer Rim," Dan reported. "Word of their defeat is spreading." No one expected a mining colony to fight back so effectively. Lyra's scales shifted, and what Dan had learned was amusement. No one expected a single human to turn a group of peaceful miners into an effective defense force. "They did that themselves," Dan corrected. "I just showed them what they were capable of." A group of young Ariels passed by, practicing the defensive movements Dan had taught them. They no longer showed fear at the concept of combat training. Instead, they approached it as a skill to be mastered, a way to protect rather than harm. "My people have always dismissed the stories of human warriors," Lyra said, watching the young ones train. "We thought beings of peace couldn't understand creatures of war. But we were wrong on both counts." Dan nodded, understanding. "Humans aren't creatures of war. We're creatures who learn to fight because sometimes the universe doesn't give you a choice. The key is remembering why you fight." The colony's new defense systems activated, running through their daily diagnostic. What had once been simple mining equipment now formed an integrated protection network, designed by minds that understood both peace and the need to defend it. "The Council needs to understand what I've learned here," Lyra continued. "Humanity isn't dangerous because you're violent. You're formidable because you understand the balance between peace and protection." "Will they listen?" "They'll have to." Lyra handed him a data crystal. "I'm recommending the establishment of a joint defense training program. Your colony has proven that different species working together, learning from each other, creates something stronger than either could achieve alone." Dan took the crystal, a slight smile crossing his face. From myths to teachers. Quite a change in perspective. The station's announcement system called for final boarding on Lyra's ship. Around them, colonists gathered to say goodbye to the Confederation crew they'd fought beside. "The stories were wrong about one thing," Lyra said as she prepared to board. "They painted humans as unstoppable warriors, forces of pure combat. But that's not what I saw here." "What did you see?" "I saw a protector, someone who fights not because they love violence, but because they refuse to let others suffer when they can help. That's what makes humans truly formidable, not your strength or skill, but your determination to stand between danger and those who need protection." Dan's expression softened. "That might be the most accurate description of humanity I've ever heard." As Lyra boarded her ship, she took one last look at the colony. The marks of battle were still visible, but so were the signs of renewal, of strength discovered, of bonds forged in adversity. Her report would change how the Confederation viewed humans, but more importantly, it would change how they viewed themselves. They had learned that being peaceful didn't mean being helpless, that understanding defense didn't mean abandoning peace. From her ship's viewport, she watched the colony grow smaller. The myth of the human warrior hadn't been disproven. It had been transformed into something far more meaningful, not just a tale of combat prowess, but a lesson about protection, determination, and the strength that comes from standing together. The human warrior wasn't just a myth anymore. He was a teacher, a protector, and now, an ally in building a stronger, safer galaxy.